The room was already buzzing before the first gavel dropped. Congressional hearings often carried tension, but this one was different. Everyone knew it. The cameras were lined up in rows, ready to capture every glare, every fumble, every sharp word exchanged. At the center of it all sat Representative Maxine Waters, known for her fiery rhetoric and unapologetic presence, had walked in with an unmistakable sense of purpose, almost daring anyone to challenge her. Across from her sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, his usual calm demeanor, masking a razor-sharp wit that many had underestimated before, always to their regret. Observers whispered quietly, some even betting under their breath about what would happen when the two inevitably clashed. Waters had made no secret of her disdain for Kennedy's style of questioning, calling it a circus act in previous interviews. Kennedy, on the other hand, was no stranger to heated confrontations. He often said his job wasn't to win friends, it was to find the truth. And today, the truth seemed destined to arrive in the most dramatic way possible as the proceedings began. The subject matter was already controversial, a debate on financial oversight and government spending priorities. The stakes were high, and the political theater even higher. Waters leaned into her microphone, her voice dripping with authority. She wasted no time in setting the tone. "Senator Kennedy," she said, emphasizing his name like a challenge. "You may have your talking points and your little sound bites, but the American people deserve serious answers, not jokes." The room stirred. It wasn't just a critique, it was a jab meant to sting. Kennedy adjusted his glasses and looked up slowly, his eyes locking on hers. He didn't speak immediately, and the silence stretched long enough for the audience to feel the weight of it. When he finally did open his mouth, it wasn't with anger, it was with a question. A deceptively simple one. "Congresswoman, are you saying the American people deserve silence when waste is staring them in the face?" His words carried the cadence of a courtroom lawyer, direct and deliberate. Waters didn't flinch. She pressed harder, accusing Kennedy of grandstanding for the cameras and turning serious oversight into late-night comedy. Each sentence was designed to chip away at his credibility. She leaned forward, raising her eyebrows, her voice rising with theatrical intensity. The cameras zoomed in. Social media was already lighting up with clips. But what no one expected was that Kennedy had been waiting for this moment, not just today, but for weeks. He had done his homework, combed through reports, pieced together inconsistencies, and prepared for exactly the kind of confrontation that was unfolding. As Waters continued, her tone dripping with disdain, Kennedy finally leaned forward, a faint smirk on his lips. "Congresswoman," he said evenly, "I've been accused of a lot of things, but wasting people's time isn't one of them. Now, if you're finished telling jokes about me, I'd like to show the American people the jokes hidden in your own numbers." His words cut like a blade, not shouted, not forced, but spoken with such clarity that the room fell into a hush. Suddenly, the balance shifted. Everyone could sense it. This wasn't going to be a one-sided humiliation. This was about to be a duel, and Kennedy had just unsheathed his sword. Maxine Waters had built her career on moments like this. She was no stranger to confrontation and no stranger to commanding a room. To her supporters, she was fearless, unapologetically bold. The kind of politician who refused to let anyone, especially someone like John Kennedy, turn the spotlight away from her. And in this hearing, she wasn't just trying to win an argument. She was trying to set a narrative. She leaned back in her chair for a moment, pretending to collect herself, and then leaned forward again, microphone catching the sharp edge in her voice. "Senator Kennedy, let me remind you, this isn't a comedy club. The American people didn't elect us to play games with oversight. They elected us to lead, to protect working families, and to ensure accountability in government spending. Now, if you'd like to trade one-liners, I suggest you try your hand on late-night television. But here, in this chamber, we deal with facts, not punchlines." The words were aimed like arrows. She delivered them with a performer's flair, pausing just long enough to let each jab land. Around the room, her allies nodded approvingly, some even smirked. The crowd behind her shuffled, whispering. To them, she had just delivered the first blow-up, calculated humiliation meant to strip Kennedy of his usual composure. But Kennedy wasn't rattled. Instead, he reached for a thick binder, sitting quietly on the desk in front of him. The binder itself seemed almost theatrical in its timing, thick, tabbed with colored markers, the kind of thing that screamed preparation. Slowly, deliberately, he flipped it open. His calm contrasted so sharply with Waters' fiery energy that the visual itself was striking. Waters noticed and doubled down, raising her voice to cut through his silence. "Senator, don't think for one second that theatrics will hide the truth. You've made a career out of playing to the cameras. But the American people don't care about your Southern charm or your clever quips. They care about jobs. They care about affordable housing. They care about justice. And while you sit here trying to turn this chamber into a stage, real families are struggling. That's the reality, not your sound bites." Applause broke out in pockets of the audience behind her. Even a few of the aides sitting at the far end of the tables smiled, as if Waters had just scored the decisive hit. Kennedy let the applause ripple and fade before looking up again. This time, he didn't smirk, didn't rush. He simply adjusted his glasses and spoke in the calm, steady cadence that was quickly becoming his signature. "Congresswoman," he said, "you mentioned reality, and you're right. Families are struggling. Housing is a crisis. Jobs are disappearing. But do you know what makes it worse? When billions of taxpayer dollars meant to solve those problems vanish into a maze of bureaucratic waste. That's not reality TV. That's reality. I brought the receipts." He tapped the binder. The sound echoed faintly against the wood of the table. Porters leaned forward, scribbling. The camera zoomed closer. Waters, for the first time, looked slightly unsettled. She hadn't expected him to come armed with specifics, she thought. He would rely on charm, maybe a quick jab, maybe even retreat into humor. Instead, Kennedy was signaling that he was prepared to go toe-to-toe, not with slogans, but with documents, audits, and numbers that could embarrass not just her, but her entire narrative. The room sensed the shift. What had begun as Waters' attempt to humiliate Kennedy was slowly morphing into a chess match, and Kennedy had just moved his first piece onto the board. The sound of that binder hitting the table wasn't just a gesture, it was a signal. Kennedy had walked into the hearing room not to play defense, but to launch an offensive. He knew Maxine Waters was going to come at him with fire, and he had prepared for it like a trial lawyer preparing for cross-examination. Slowly, he flipped the first tab, each page marked with meticulous highlights. The room, which had moments earlier been filled with applause for Waters' fiery speech, grew quieter. Even the rustling of papers from aides died down. Kennedy cleared his throat and spoke with deliberate precision. "Congresswoman, you said we're here to deal with facts." "I couldn't agree more. So, let's start with the facts." He paused, letting his southern drawl stretch the words just enough to hold the room's attention. According to the most recent oversight report, your office approved a spending package worth $2.3 billion for community housing initiatives. Admirable on the surface. But when auditors traced those funds, nearly 40% couldn't be accounted for. That's almost $1 billion gone poof without explanation. A murmur swept through the chamber. Waters stiffened, her expression hardening, but Kennedy didn't stop. He turned another page. "Now, you tell the American people you're protecting working families. I believe you mean it. But I've got receipts here that show millions of those dollars ended up in projects that were either never started or abandoned halfway. Contractors paid, but no houses built. Families promised, but none delivered. That's not protecting them. Congresswoman, that's betraying them." Words landed like hammer blows. The camera zoomed in on Waters' face, capturing the faintest flicker of discomfort. She quickly straightened her papers, clearly preparing to counterpunch. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He turned another tab in the binder. "And since you brought up leadership," Kennedy continued, "let's talk about accountability. Because I've also got documentation here showing that when questions were raised about these missing funds, your committee declined to pursue them." Declined, Congresswoman, not overlooked, not delayed, declined. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone could feel the tables turning. The same audience that had applauded Waters minutes earlier now sat frozen, waiting to see how she would respond. Waters leaned into her microphone, her tone sharp, almost defensive. Senator Kennedy, you're twisting figures and cherry-picking numbers? Oversight is complicated, and you know it. Can't just pull one report and claim corruption where there is none. We're dealing with systemic issues that span decades. To suggest otherwise is misleading and, frankly, irresponsible. Kennedy let her finish, then leaned forward, his voice steady. Congresswoman, with all due respect, families waiting for homes don't care about decades of excuses. They don't care about systemic issues being used as a shield. They care about roofs over their heads. They care about promises kept. And if billions of dollars vanish under your watch, I don't think they're the ones being irresponsible. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Some reporters raised their eyebrows, already typing headlines into their laptops. Kennedy wasn't yelling, he wasn't mocking. He was simply stacking fact upon fact, number upon number, until Waters. Earlier accusations of grandstanding looked weaker by the minute. Waters, however, wasn't done. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing, calculating her next strike. If Kennedy wanted a fight built on documents, she was determined to turn the spotlight back to his motives. But for now, the crowd sensed it. Kennedy had drawn first blood with cold. Undeniable receipts, and the hearing was no longer hers to control. The duel had only just begun. Maxine Waters had been in politics long enough to know when an opponent had landed a blow. Kennedy's binder wasn't just a prop, it was a weapon, and in the last few minutes, he had swung it with precision. The murmurs in the chamber were proof enough that his receipts had struck a chord. But Waters wasn't about to let herself be cornered on her own stage. She straightened her papers, exhaled sharply, and leaned into the microphone with the same commanding presence that had defined her career. This time her target wasn't numbers or oversight report. It was Kennedy himself. "Senator," she began, her tone sharpened like steel, "you'd love to play the role of the truth-teller? You sit there with your binder full of so-called facts as if that makes you the savior of accountability. But let's be clear, you're not here because you care about housing or families or justice. You're here because you crave headlines. You thrive on spectacle. You build your brand by dragging people through the mud. And today, you chose me." The words hit like daggers, each one carefully crafted to shift the spotlight back onto Kennedy's motives. She pressed harder, raising her voice to echo off the walls. "Let's not pretend. You don't show up to hearings like these to solve problems. You show up to score points, to make clips for cable news, and to get applause from your base back home. You hide behind receipts, but everyone in this room knows your performance is more about theater than truth." What? A ripple of applause came from her supporters in the audience. Some even shouted, "That's right." The cameras swung back toward Kennedy, eager to capture his reaction. But Waters wasn't finished. She leaned even closer, her voice dropping slightly, adding an edge of personal attack. "You accuse me of excuses. Well, let me ask you, where were you when your own state's families were struggling with hurricanes and floods? Where was that binder when Louisiana's infrastructure crumbled year after year? It's easy to come after me in front of these cameras, but I don't see you applying that same energy when it comes to cleaning up your own backyard." The line landed hard. Even Kennedy's aides looked momentarily stiff, knowing Waters had shifted the battle from policy to personal credibility. The audience stirred, some nodding, some murmuring approval. Waters had successfully reframed the confrontation, not as one between accountability and waste, but as one between an opportunist and a true fighter for her people. Kennedy, however, didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses again and gave a faint smile, almost as if he had expected this line of attack all along. He leaned into the microphone slowly, the calmness of his tone a sharp contrast to Waters' fiery delivery. "Congresswoman," he said evenly, "you're right about one thing. I am here to shine a light, but it's not on me. It's on the numbers. It's on the missing billions. It's on promises made but never delivered. Now, if you'd like to talk about Louisiana, I'd be happy to. Because unlike what I've found in your reports, I can show you dollar for dollar where our relief money went. Every cent accounted for." Can you say the same about your billion-dollar mystery fund? The chamber stirred again. Dodgety had turned her attack right back onto her, doubling down on the very issue she was trying to deflect from. Waters blinked, just for a moment, before recovering her composure. But the damage was clear. Kennedy wasn't rattled, and that was the danger. The more she came at him personally, the more he seemed to steady himself, anchoring his arguments. In hard numbers and calm delivery, it was a dangerous contrast. Her fire against his ice, her passion against his precision. The audience was starting to feel it. The hearing wasn't just a battle of facts anymore. It was becoming a test of character, and Kennedy was proving he could take punches without losing his footing. For several minutes, the hearing had felt like a tug of war. Waters with her fiery accusations, Kennedy with his calm rebuttals. Audience leaned forward, captivated by the duel. But Kennedy hadn't yet revealed his strongest card. That moment was coming, and when it did, the chamber would fall into stunned silence. Kennedy flipped another tab in his binder. The sound of the paper against the microphone amplified in the stillness of the room, glancing briefly at Waters before addressing the chamber. His voice was calm, steady, almost conversational. "Congresswoman, you've said I'm here for theater. You've said I'm grandstanding. Maybe so. But let me ask everyone here when the facts are. This outrageous? Isn't silence the real theater?" He lifted a page from the binder and held it up so the cameras could zoom in. "This," he said, "is a copy of an internal audit. Not one from my staff, but from the Government Accountability Office. And it states very clearly that funds meant for affordable housing in Los Angeles or district, Congresswoman, were diverted to entities with no track record, no completed projects, and in one case, no physical office. Millions of taxpayer dollars went to ghost companies. Companies that don't exist beyond a name on paper." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Even some of Waters' allies exchanged uneasy glances. Kennedy continued, his words precise, his cadence deliberate, and it gets worse. "Because those same companies received follow-up funding months later, despite never fulfilling their first contracts. Congresswoman, this isn't me twisting numbers. This isn't spin. This is your oversight, or lack thereof, signed off by your own committee." Waters shifted in her chair, her jaw tightening. She reached for her papers, rifling through them as though searching for a counterpoint. But Kennedy didn't let up. "You told me earlier that the American people don't need punchlines. You're right. They need accountability. They need someone to explain why billions meant for working families ended up in the pockets of phantom corporations. So tell me, Congresswoman, where are the houses? Where are the roofs? Where is the justice for those families you claim to fight for?" His voice didn't rise. He didn't shout. But the silence that followed was deafening. Reporters. Pens scratched furiously against their notepads. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Waters' every reaction. Her allies looked tense, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, she leaned into her microphone, her tone clipped and defensive. "Senator, those allegations are being reviewed. You know as well as I do that in large-scale programs, not every project moves smoothly. Mistakes happen. But to stand here and suggest corruption without due process is reckless. This is political theater at its worst." Kennedy leaned back, his expression almost sympathetic. "Congresswoman, if this is theater, I didn't write the script. Your numbers did. And the American people aren't watching for entertainment. They're watching because they want answers. They're watching because they want to know why their money is vanishing like smoke. And frankly, they're tired of hearing that billions of dollars gone is just a mistake." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The balance of power in the hearing had shifted again, and this time it was unmistakable. Waters had tried to frame Kennedy as an opportunist chasing headlines, but Kennedy had just reframed her as a guardian of broken promises, leader unable to account for the very fund she claimed to champion. For the first time, the fire in Waters' eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of hesitation. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though unsure of how to proceed. The audience waited, breathless, for her next move. But in that moment, one truth was undeniable. Kennedy had landed a blow so sharp, so heavy with evidence that even Maxine Waters, usually untouchable in her confidence, was left without words. The silence in the chamber lingered uncomfortably. For a split second, it felt as though time itself had stopped, Kennedy's words still hanging in the air. Waters' hesitation magnified by the cameras zoomed tightly on her face. Everyone knew she couldn't stay silent forever. That wasn't her style. Maxine Waters inhaled deeply, straightened her back, and leaned into the microphone once more. Her voice carried the familiar fire, though her tone was just slightly more measured than before. "Senator Kennedy," she began, "I will not allow you to stand here and accuse me of corruption. I will not allow you to smear my record with insinuations and cherry-picked audits. I have served the American people for decades, and I will not be lectured by someone who has built a career on sound bites and sensationalism. You may wave your binder around, but you don't speak for the families in my district. I do." Her supporters in the audience clapped, some standing briefly in applause, trying to reignite the energy that had slipped away. Waters pressed on, seizing the moment. "Let's be very clear about what's happening here. This is not about oversight. This is about distraction. While you posture for the cameras, Senator, families in Louisiana and across this nation are looking for solutions, not blame games. What you call receipts are nothing more than political ammunition. I refuse to let you weaponize the struggles of working families to score yourself a headline." The applause grew louder, though not as unanimous as before. Waters looked relieved to have wrestled back some ground. She knew Kennedy's binder carried weight, but her best defense was to attack the messenger, to make Kennedy himself the issue. And for a moment, it worked. The audience shifted slightly, reporters scribbling about her fiery counterattack, some noting the applause. But Kennedy didn't rise to the bait. He didn't bristle or lash out. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses with a calm that almost seemed rehearsed. When the applause died down, he leaned into the microphone and spoke slowly, as though every word was placed with surgical precision. "Congresswoman," he said, "you keep accusing me of chasing headlines. But headlines don't vanish into thin air. Billions of taxpayer dollars do. And if your defense is that audits are political ammunition, then I fear the American people have their answer about where accountability stands in this chamber." The murmurs started again, louder this time. Kennedy flipped to another section of his binder and held up a chart. "This isn't me. This isn't my staff. This is from the HUD Inspector General. It says, in plain English, that funds under your oversight were funneled into projects without oversight you were supposed to provide." "That's not my spin, Congresswoman. That's the government's own watchdog saying it." It's gasps echoed through the crowd. Waters clenched her jaw, visibly bracing against the blow. Kennedy let the moment settle before continuing. "Said you've served the American people for decades, and I don't doubt that you believe you have. But service isn't about speeches. It's about results. And right now, the results show broken promises, missing money, and families still waiting for the help they were promised." The words were deliberate, unhurried, but devastating. Reporters typed furiously, knowing this exchange would dominate headlines by nightfall. Waters opened her mouth to respond but stopped, realizing anything she said might only dig the hole deeper. She shifted in her chair, her fire flickering but not extinguished. Kennedy leaned back once more, his voice calm, almost quiet. "I didn't come here to humiliate you, Congresswoman. I came here to demand accountability. If accountability leaves you speechless, then perhaps the American people should be asking why." The chamber fell silent again. This time the silence wasn't. Aquadit was heavy. Waters, for all her fiery rhetoric, had been cornered. And Kennedy, without raising his voice, had made it clear. This wasn't about theater. It was about truth. And the truth had teeth. When the gavel finally struck to adjourn the hearing, the chamber erupted into a frenzy. Reporters rushed too. The hallways, their cameras flashing, microphones extended, each one eager to capture the first reaction. What had started as a typical oversight session had turned into a political theater of the highest order. And every outlet wanted to be the first to frame the narrative. On one side of the room, Maxine Waters exited quickly, surrounded by aides, who shielded her from the swarm of journalists. Her expression was tight, lips pressed into a thin line as she waved off questions. "I said what I needed to say inside," she snapped at one reporter, brushing past. This isn't about me, it's about the American people, and I will continue to fight for them. But the lack of detail in her response only fueled speculation that Kennedy had hit a nerve. Meanwhile, Kennedy walked out on the opposite side of the chamber, trailed by cameras and journalists firing questions at rapid speed. He didn't rush. In fact, he moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. His glasses glinted under the bright lights as he stopped briefly at the microphones. "I didn't go in there to fight with Congresswoman Waters," he said evenly. "Went in there to ask why billions of taxpayer dollars disappeared without explanation. Someone calls that theater, so be it. But I think the American people would call it oversight." The quote spread like wildfire. Within minutes, cable news networks had cut into their regular programming to broadcast clips of the exchange. On one channel, a panel of analysts debated whether Waters had overplayed her hand by going after Kennedy personally. "She tried to paint him as a clown," one commentator said, "but he turned the tables by staying calm, presenting evidence, and letting the facts speak louder than the rhetoric." Another panel on a rival network took the opposite view, insisting Kennedy had exploited the hearing for political gain. "This was classic John Kennedy," a pundit argued. "He comes armed with binders and zingers, knowing full well the cameras are rolling." Was it effective? Sure. But was it genuine oversight or performance art? That's the question. On social media, the clash was trending within the hour. Hashtags with both Waters and Kennedy's names shot to the top of Twitter. Clips of Kennedy calmly flipping through his binder racked up millions of views, while others circulated Waters' fiery accusations that he was nothing more than a headline chaser. Memes flooded in, some portraying Kennedy as a poker-faced truth-teller, others mocking the exchange as Bindergate. In Los Angeles, Waters' supporters rallied quickly, praising her for standing up to what they called Kennedy's grandstanding. But in Louisiana and beyond, Kennedy's allies celebrated the moment as proof of his ability to stand firm against Washington's entrenched establishment. Editorials were already being drafted, some calling Kennedy's calm delivery a masterclass in political strategy, others calling Waters' defensive posture a rare misstep from a seasoned veteran. Back inside the Capitol, whispers spread among lawmakers. Some privately admitted they had underestimated Kennedy's preparation. Others warned that Waters' slip could have lasting consequences, not just for her credibility, but for broader oversight discussions. The phrase "left speechless" began popping up repeatedly in commentary and ironic twist, considering Waters was known for her sharp tongue and quick comebacks. Kennedy, for his part, didn't gloat. As he left the building, he simply told a small cluster of reporters, "I don't enjoy this, but I won't apologize for asking questions the American people deserve answers to." That line, too, made headlines by nightfall. The confrontation had become the top story across nearly every network. Whether people saw Kennedy as a hero or a showman didn't matter. What mattered was that he had dominated the narrative. And Waters, for the first time in a long time, found herself on the defensive. The cameras eventually moved on, but for Maxine Waters, the sting of the hearing lingered long after the last reporter had packed up their microphone. She retreated to her office, flanked by aides and advisors who moved quickly to secure the door and silence the chaos outside. Inside, the mood was tense. Papers lay scattered across the long conference table, television screens replaying the clips on an endless loop. Each time Kennedy's calm voice said, "I brought the receipts," Waters clenched her jaw a little tighter. Her senior aide broke the silence. "Congresswoman, we need to get ahead of this. Right now the headlines are running with his framing that you were caught off guard, that he exposed you. If we don't put out a strong statement by tonight, we'll lose control of the narrative entirely." Waters paced the room, her heels clicking against the floor. She was angry at Kennedy, angry at the cameras, angry at how a hearing she thought she could dominate had slipped away from her. But most of all, she was angry at herself for letting him corner her with those audit reports. "He thinks he's clever," she muttered, almost to herself. "That southern charm, that binder of his. But I've been in this game too long, too. Let one stunt define me." Another advisor leaned forward, lowering his voice. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, this wasn't just a stunt. He had documents, He had specifics. We need to counter with our own numbers, real projects funded. Families helped. If we can't disprove his claims outright, we need to reframe them. Waters stopped pacing and turned sharply. Reframe, she repeated. He's accusing me of corruption, of letting billions slip through my fingers. You don't reframe. Something like that, you fight it head on. But even as she spoke, she knew the damage had been done. Kennedy hadn't shouted, hadn't ranted. He had simply laid out his case like a prosecutor in a courtroom, and she had played directly into his hands by going after his character instead of dismantling his facts. That contrast her fire against his ice was exactly what the media was feeding on now. Her communications director finally spoke up, sliding a draft statement across the table. Here's our play. We acknowledge that oversight is never perfect. There are always delays, always complications in large federal programs. But we frame Kennedy's performance as exactly that, a performance. We paint him as an opportunist, exploiting bureaucratic hiccups to make himself look like a hero. We remind people of your decades-long record of fighting for housing and families. We make this about him trying to score points instead of solving problems. Waters scanned the statement, her eyes narrowing. It was safe, calculated. But it wasn't enough to erase the images playing on the TV screens, her frown, his calm smirk, the silence after his question. Where are the houses? Outline. It was already being replayed 1,000 times across the internet. She dropped the paper on the table. It's not enough, she said flatly. We need more than words. We need action. Line up surrogates for the Sunday shows. Get community leaders from my district on record, talking about the real successes families we have helped, housing we have built, and I want a press conference tomorrow. If Kennedy wants to play lawyer with binders, I'll bring receipts of my own. Her aides nodded, scribbling notes, already making calls. The room came alive with motion, the hum of strategy replacing the silence of shock. Waters, ever the fighter, wasn't about to roll over. She knew the headlines had painted her as speechless, but she wasn't going to stay that way. Still deep down, she recognized the uphill climb ahead. Kennedy had stolen the moment with quiet precision, and undoing that impression would take more than fiery speeches. It would take proof, coordination, perhaps even a little humility, something she rarely allowed herself to show. For now, though, Waters steeled herself. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. While Maxine Waters was locked away in her office regrouping with her aides, John Kennedy was doing what he did best, turning a single moment into a narrative that the public wouldn't forget. Within hours of the hearing, clips of his exchange had spread across social media. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, everywhere. People were sharing the now viral moment when he calmly asked, "Where are the houses?" And Waters had been left without a direct answer. Kennedy didn't need to chase the spotlight. It came to him.
Oh.
News producers flooded his staff with requests for interviews, wanting him on primetime slots to discuss what had just happened. His aides worked quickly to pick the most strategic appearances, balancing mainstream outlets with conservative platforms where his base would cheer him on the loudest that evening. Kennedy appeared on a national cable news show, sitting comfortably in a chair, binder once again on the table beside him. He smiled as the host rolled the clip. The audience laughed softly at Waters' stunned expression, and the host turned to him with a grin. "Senator Kennedy, you seemed awfully prepared for that exchange. Walk us through what was going through your mind." Kennedy leaned back, his drawl deliberate and steady. "Well, I'll tell you, I didn't come there to embarrass anyone. But when taxpayer dollars go missing, when folks back home are still waiting, on homes they were promised, diced my job to ask questions. And I brought the receipts, because the American people deserve straight answers, not slogans." The host nodded, and Kennedy continued. "Look, I got nothing against Congresswoman Waters personally. But she's been in charge of these funds. And when the numbers don't add up, somebody's got to speak up. Where I come from, you don't spend money you don't have. And you sure don't lose track of billions without explaining it." It was classic Kennedy plainspoken, cutting, but never shouting. The clip went viral again, this time with his follow-up interview, reinforcing the same point. Commentators across the political spectrum had no choice but to weigh in. Supporters praised his courage, calling him a watchdog for accountability. Even some critics admitted he had landed a devastatingly effective blow. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy's constituents were delighted. Call-in shows buzzed with locals saying things like, "That's our guy. He speaks for us." And finally, someone calling them out. At town halls, people lined up to shake his hand, repeating the line back to him, "Where are the houses?" It had already taken on a life of its own, becoming more than just a question. It was now a symbol of government waste and bureaucratic failure. Kennedy's team saw the opportunity and ran with it. They cut short videos for social media, overlaying charts and statistics on top of the exchange. They crafted posts that framed him as the lone truth-teller in a sea of excuses. They even printed T-shirts with the slogan subtle but enough to catch attention among supporters. But Kennedy wasn't just celebrating. He was also strategic. In closed-door meetings with his staff, he cautioned them not to overplay their hand. "The moment speaks for itself," he told them. "If we start crowing too loud, folks will say we're macking it personal. Let's keep it about the facts, about accountability. Let the people see the difference between substance and sound bites." That restraint made his message even stronger. Each interview he gave was disciplined, each statement tightly focused. He avoided direct insults and instead hammered the theme of accountability, knowing it made him look like the adult in the room. Meanwhile, media analysts began framing the showdown as a defining clash of styles: Waters' fiery attacks versus Kennedy's calm precision. And in that comparison, Kennedy consistently came out on top. The more Waters scrambled to reframe the narrative, the more Kennedy's steady image solidified. By the end of the week, it wasn't just a story about a heated exchange in Congress. It was a story about Kennedy's rising profile, his ability to cut through the noise with simple, effective points. His name was trending nationally, his base was energized, and even casual observers who had never paid attention to Senate hearings were suddenly quoting him. Kennedy had seized the spotlight, not by force, but by preparation and timing. For Waters, the battle had become about damage control. For Kennedy, it was now about momentum, and he wasn't slowing down. The dust from the fiery hearing didn't settle quickly. For days, headlines replayed the same clip: Maxine Waters throwing out her fiery accusations, followed by John Kennedy's calm, cutting question that left her without a clear response. It wasn't just a moment in Washington. It had become a national talking point. Across cable news, pundits debated who had come out on top. Some progressive commentators defended Waters, arguing that her passion was admirable, but even they admitted she had stumbled when pressed with hard evidence. Conservative voices, meanwhile, hailed Kennedy as the rare lawmaker willing to speak truth to power without theatrics. Neutral outlets, too, couldn't deny the optics. Waters looked flustered. Kennedy looked prepared, and in politics, optics often matter more than words. In Louisiana, Kennedy was greeted like a hometown hero. Small-town diners, barbershops, and church gatherings buzzed with conversations about how their senator had stood his ground. People quoted his words back to each other, treating "Where are the houses?" like both a punchline and a rallying cry. For many Americans frustrated with government waste, the phrase summed up their own frustrations in 4 simple words. Meanwhile, Waters' office scrambled. Press releases were issued, interviews were scheduled, and allies were called upon to help reshape the story. But every attempt seemed to backfire. She claimed Kennedy was engaging in political theater. Critics pointed out that he had stuck to the facts while she had raised her voice. When she tried to highlight past achievements, interviewers inevitably circled back to the missing funds. The more she tried to push back, the more the public remembered her silence at the critical moment. Kennedy, by contrast, didn't rub salt in the wound. He didn't mock her, didn't gloat, didn't give her fresh ammunition. Instead, he let the moment live on its own. Each time a reporter asked him about the clash, he calmly redirected to the core issue: taxpayer accountability. "This isn't about me or her," he said in one interview. "It's about the American people and their money. I just asked a simple question, and I'm still waiting on a simple answer." That restraint made him look measured, disciplined, and trustworthy, qualities voters respected even if they didn't always agree with his politics. Within weeks, Kennedy's approval ratings ticked upward. Fundraising surged as donors across the country cited his willingness to hold colleagues accountable. His clips continued to circulate online, reaching audiences far beyond his usual base. Young voters who normally ignored Senate hearings were remixing his line into memes, GIFs, and viral TikToks. Maxine Waters, meanwhile, saw her reputation take a hit. She still had her loyal supporters, but there was no denying that the exchange had bruised her credibility. For a politician who prided herself on sharp rhetoric, being left speechless on such a visible stage was a rare and damaging blow. The showdown became more than just a one-off clash. It became a symbol of two styles of politics colliding, of fiery rhetoric versus quiet precision, and in that comparison, Kennedy had won decisively. In speeches later that year, Kennedy would allude to the moment without naming names. "I'll never stop asking questions when the numbers don't add up," he told one rally. Because if Washington can't explain where your money went, then Washington doesn't deserve to spend another dime of it. The crowd roared, and the slogan lived on. For Waters, the incident lingered as an unwelcome reminder of how quickly political fortunes can shift. For Kennedy, it became a cornerstone of his image. The senator who came armed with facts, delivered his line with calm conviction, and left one of Washington's most combative figures in stunned silence. In the end, the story wasn't just about humiliation or a heated exchange. It was about how preparation, discipline, and timing could turn one question into a defining moment. John Kennedy had walked into that hearing ready for a fight, but he had walked out with something far more: power.